hallucinations, burned down houses, more wristwatches, and a police force that doesn't seem to have the faintest idea what it's doing. We've arrived at the moment we've all been waiting for, the arrest of the Yorkshire Ripper. Welcome back to my series on David Peace's Red Riding Quartet. Are you ready for the plot to get even more complicated, for even more characters to get introduced, and to still not really have a clue what the hell is going on? Are you ready to see even more characters descend into madness, to experience the return of Jack Whitehead with a screwdriver in his head, to have the real-life events of the Yorkshire Ripper murders projected onto a crime story so unsettling that you won't be able to sleep, to be so disturbed you'll be asking whether David Peace is right in the head? This is 1980. David Peace's novel 1980, the third in the Red Riding Quartet, continues in much the same vein as the two which preceded it. It begins with Peace talking to the reader directly, in what should be his dedication section. For the dead, a compass, the living, salt. Sorry, Dave, what? And then a brief epilogue to the last novel, where we learn that Eric Hall, a police officer we got to know in the last novel 1977, and who was most definitely very dirty, has had his throat slit, and the perpetrators then proceeded to rape his wife. Start as you mean to go on, and the novel just gets worse from there. Turn the page, read the title. Part 1, Saint Cunt. Right, that's how this is going to be then. Each chapter of 1980 begins with the transmission, which is actually a transcription of a recorded interview tape. They're written in unbroken, punctuationless stream of consciousness style, and are mostly recordings of the Yorkshire Ripper confessing to each of his crimes in graphic, intimate detail, though some are obviously witness statements and interviews with the survivors. Sometimes each chapter will be a new transmission, other times the text flows over from one to the other over chapters, meaning the only way to get a comprehensible overview of the recordings is by reading the first page of every chapter one after the other. The setting and time are immediately set. Our main character, Peter Hunter, wakes to Yoko Ono talking on the radio about John Lennon's death. Puts us close to Christmas in 1980, and Hunter mentions he needs to go to Whitby, which, assuming he's not too far away from there, puts us in Yorkshire. Finally, his wife asks him, it was him then, and we know she means the Yorkshire Ripper, that he's back after a long break of being away, that it's happening all over again. Peace is really good at doing this, at setting the scene for his books. Time, location, atmosphere, with just a really small bit of information, a nod here and there. Then he kind of ruins it by writing exactly where Hunter drives to, and then another few lines of radio broadcast that explain precisely that the Ripper has killed his 13th victim. But anyway, the first paragraph is still really good. Just these few lines afterwards felt a little bit like padding, that they weren't really needed, especially for a set of novels which are so shrouded in mystery the whole time. But if the previous novels are anything to go by, the radio show by Yoko Ono is probably something that actually happened. Peace makes sure that every small detail in his novels, the weather, the things on the radio, the true events surrounding the novelization he's writing are all things which actually happened at that moment in time. It's something that makes the stories he tells even more disturbing and horrific. You feel like you're there, and almost everything you read in these novels is true, at least in terms of the small details. And even though it's all true, I'll say it anyway, in case you want to read the novels. Spoilers. Hunter goes to meet some higher-ups in the police force. At the house of one Philip Evans, he hears the Wareside Jack tape. So a short side note here. Wareside Jack, aka John Samuel Humble, was a man from Wareside, County Durham, who sent a number of letters to the police and journalists, which we actually saw examples of throughout Peace's 1977 to journalist Jack Whitehead. And he also made an audio tape which plays a big role in this novel, 1980. The Wareside Jack hoax caused the police to divert resources away from West Yorkshire and to Wareside because the voice on the tape had an accent from that area, which prolonged the investigation, during which the real Ripper carried on killing for at least another year and a half. And the audio tape in 1980 is accurate to the tape that Wareside Jack actually recorded, but with one difference. There's an extra part at the end in a sort of nonsense language, which doesn't become clear until later in the story with the help of Jack Whitehead. This extra part of the tape didn't exist. The rest, though, is true. And in 1980, the police already know that the tape is, as they put it, bollocks. Westside Jack sent his recording in June of 1979, and this is a year and a half later. So back to the book. Hunter's a well-to-do copper who has already led internal investigations into other police officers, making him hated in the force. It seems like he has it together, but beneath the surface he's an insomniac obsessed with the Ripper killings, who's falling apart, partly because of the pressure of the Ripper killings, the horrific nature of them, but also because he isn't able to have children with his wife, and that's the one thing that he really, really wants. He's been tasked with looking into the Yorkshire Ripper case, making sure the police are doing all they can, and finally to catch the Ripper. And he picks 4 people. John Murphy and Helen Marshall are 2 of the people he picks, and they're the 2 most important to us for now. You learn that Murphy and Hunter both investigated the Stratford pub shooting in 1974, which we know was committed by journalist Eddie Dumford from the first novel. And you know that Hunter knew that something was wrong with it and headed an investigation into the incident, which led to nothing because it was being covered up. You also meet George Oldman, who's based on the real-life Assistant Chief Constable of West Yorkshire Police, George Oldfield, who was heavily criticised for his role in the Ripper investigation, and also strongly believed in the Westside Jack tapes, which were revealed to be a hoax. And it doesn't happen in these novels, but in 1985, the real Oldfield had several heart attacks, which were attributed to the long hours and stress of the Ripper investigation. And the first time we meet Oldman/Oldfield in the novel 1980, he's relieved of his duties on the Ripper investigation. It's one of the first things that happens. So Hunter begins his investigation. One of the first things he says to his team of detectives is that the Yorkshire Ripper will already be named somewhere in the files the West Yorkshire Police have on the case. And he's right. In real life, Peter Sutcliffe, the actual Yorkshire Ripper, was interviewed 9 times before he was finally arrested. And they caught him basically just because of dumb luck, which I'll get to later. Hunter tells some of the top brass, 2 men named Alderman and Noble, that they have already had the Ripper in, that he's got the same life stresses that everyone else does, and that he's mobile, able to go places he normally wouldn't. So a taxi driver, a lorry driver, even a police officer. But it's obvious that the West Yorkshire Police aren't going to make things easy for Hunter. Officers who investigate other officers have always had a bad reputation in the police force. Hunter's is no different. First, they give him a letter which has apparently come from the Home Office, which severely limits his ability to grass on officers who he's found committing crimes. Then they dilly-dally while getting him an office to work in their headquarters, and finally they don't allow him access to their files directly. Instead, they give him a liaison who has to sort it all out for him, which impedes the investigation further. Later, the Yorkshire Six, a group of coppers who are involved in corruption and crimes, as I mentioned in the last episode, take even more drastic measures to hinder him investigating them as he gets closer to the truth. More on that later. And guess who the liaison is? It's a crooked copper by the name of Bob Craven, who got shot in 1974 by Eddie Dumford, almost definitely killed a prostitute in 1975, and has all 20 of his dirty fingers and toes in every dirty bent and stolen pie in the Yorkshire area. Peace increases the repetition, the refrains in this novel even further than the last 2, which I didn't think was possible. It makes the book a really quick read, as so much of it you've read before. Hunter has war constantly on his mind. The Ripper's always taunting him, from the streets of Wakefield to the shed in his back garden, where he has lists of all the women killed and other information pertaining to the case, and which he calls the war room, where he wages battle against Yorkshire's common foe. The police, though, are losing. They're embroiled in, as Hunter puts it, murder and lies, lies and murder, war, my war. And these themes, these obsessive thoughts keep coming up time and again. The repetition, a constant refrain, a constant chorus, like a nightmarish song that makes you feel like you're descending into madness along with Hunter. There's a policeman's ball. Someone from Vice, the police that deal with gambling, prostitution and organised crime, approaches Hunter and tells him that he knows Helen Marshall, the detective Hunter has decided is going to help him in his investigation into the Ripper case and the police. Before Hunter can ask anything more, the man's gone. Then we meet Richard Dawson, a key player in this whole scenario, not that we know it yet, but Hunter and Dawson are obviously friends, and Dawson's being investigated by the police. Hunter says he'll help out. The following day, Hunter finds from a certain police officer, Sergeant Douglas, who was also there when Eddie Dumford shot up the pub in 1974 but was left alive, that someone has been telling the police that Hunter himself is dirty, and involved in the vague financial trouble that Dawson's involved in, which is the reason Dawson's being investigated by the police. As Hunter's dream team are going through their cases, they realise something. Several of the murders were probably not committed by the Yorkshire Ripper. Two of the women, Janice Ryan, who we found out about as Sergeant Bob Fraser's girlfriend in the last novel, 1977, and Claire Strachan, who we know was one of the prostitutes and pornographic models being pimped by the police, also from 1977, have been killed in different ways to the Ripper's modus operandi. And then Reverend Laws shows up again, in his dark coat and his hat, and he brings with him Elizabeth Hall, the wife of the deceased Eric Hall. She tells Hunter what happened to her and says it was a gang who had also been going around robbing post offices. Those among you with good memories might recall that Sergeant Bob Fraser, who killed himself on the moors after learning that his girlfriend Janice was dead after becoming pregnant with his child, had been pulled off the Ripper case once or twice during 1977 to investigate a series of post office robberies by a gang of men who called themselves the Spencer Boys. And it's these same men who killed Eric Hall, and Elizabeth Hall is convinced that the murder of her husband, an attempted murder of her, was some sort of cover-up by the police, that Eric Hall had known that Janice Ryan wasn't killed by the Ripper, but by the police themselves, that he knew it would be found out by Peter Hunter, and that Hall's misdeeds would be found out too, and that he was killed for this reason. A chapter later, though, Hunter's talking to Detective Chief Superintendent Maurice Jobson, who tells him that Hall was definitely killed by the Spencer Boys, either because he was blackmailing them or because he was building a case against them. Jobson, by the way, is embroiled in everything that's been going on, and in fact is one half of the narration of the following and final novel, 1983, but I'll get to that in the next episode. Hunter goes to bed more confused than when he started, and while I was reading this, so did I. As I mentioned in the last episode, 77, the plot is dense, meandering, stuffed full of different threads and characters who you need to keep tabs on, or else you'll completely lose track of what's going on. You need to read these books with an Excel sheet if you're going to keep track, to be honest. Anyway, the dread starts to set in thickly. Hunter goes to see Jack Whitehead, who talks in these nonsensical riddles in an insane asylum, looked after by a man named Leonard Marsh. Whitehead's fully insane, squatting in his room like a gargoyle, as Peace puts it, recounting his hallucinations as though they're in the room with him. And you can see Peace is trying to truly convey the madness these characters have descended into due to what's going on around them. This links back to the constant repetition that they are at war. One of the most awful things that can happen is happening right on their doorstep, and again, they're losing the battle. And slowly you can see that someone is trying to either frame or push out Hunter. Officer Douglas, whom Hunter met because he was investigating Richard Dawson, is found dead, as is his little daughter, just 6 years old. Hunter plays some tapes that Eric Hall's wife, Elizabeth, has given to him, which reveal that Richard Dawson was indeed involved with something with Hall, and evidently others, like Douglas, but it's unclear what. And he also finds the pornographic magazine Spunk, which was a big plot point in the previous novel, 1977. He sees the picture of Janice Ryan in the magazine, and hears either Robert Craven's or maybe Robert Douglas's voice on the tapes. So it's confirmed. Craven and Dawson were definitely into something together, which Hall knew all about, and it seems like they killed Janice Ryan and would have killed Bob Fraser if he hadn't killed himself. While the plot unravels around Hunter, he begins to descend slowly into madness too. He no longer sleeps at all, he's more obsessed with the Ripper than ever, and now with the conspiracy, and he begins to imagine monstrous black wings sprouting from his back, as though he's an angel of death, come to reap havoc on the Yorkshire police force. And the well-to-do Peter Hunter begins to express it too. At one moment, another police officer, Roger Hook, recounts the plot up to now pretty well, so I'm just going to read that bit. So let me get this straight. You're telling me that your mate Tricky Dicky, Dawson, rents out a building to some pornographers who use Janice Ryan as a model. The same Janice Ryan who's knocking off Robert Fraser and Eric Hall. The same woman who gets done in by the Ripper. So then Jack Whitehead tries to blackmail Eric Hall, and 3 years later his prints turn up on a cassette tape that also has your name on it. Turns up in the mouth of an ex-Yorkshire copper, a dead ex-Yorkshire copper who was working for, wait for it, working for Richard Dawson, Tricky Dicky himself, your mate. But it's not a small world, eh Pete? In response, Hunter tells him it isn't a small world. It's a big, black, bloody world full of a million black and bloody hells, and when those hells collide, it's time for us to sit up and take fucking notice. The Hunter we knew 100 pages ago wouldn't have spoken like this. The stresses of the job, the constant back and forth between Leeds and Manchester, the knowledge that his wife is missing him but still can't get pregnant, and the shame that the Ripper is still out there, all these things are taking their toll on his mental health. He begins to get more and more obsessed with the link between Robert Douglas, Richard Dawson, and the pornographic magazines, to the extent that he shows up at the widow Douglas's house and taunts her with the magazine, asking if she and Robert met while working on them. Then he breaks into a small flat above a newsagent's, finding out that this was the location the dirty coppers would take photographs of women for the magazine, and make sure that whoever owns it knows that someone's been there. The next night someone blows it up. And then Hunter receives a note from the Ripper, but we know it isn't the Ripper. It's one of the dirty coppers who's trying to prevent him from sticking his nose in their dirty business. The letter says, "I'm going to kill your wife and kids," though he doesn't have any, much to his chagrin. So the police are now protecting Hunter's wife Joan on Christmas Day, and when they go and see her parents, they return and the house has been burned down. At this point, something I mentioned in the episode on 1974 happens. Hunter's wife gets him a new digital watch for Christmas. He takes off his father's watch, which he's been referring to every few pages or so in hours and minutes, and starts looking at the time in hours, minutes and seconds. And somehow, even though it takes longer this way, because he's now giving 3 sets of numbers rather than just 2, seeing the seconds on the watch helps the pace to pick up. We're now 300 pages in, closing in on the finishing line, and so the pace needs to pick up, and the frequencies of murders, of death, because Eric Hall's wife has also committed suicide by this time, does help to increase the pace as well. Hunter returns to work after the fire in his home to find he is now himself being investigated, and in a the trial, Kafkaesque type situation, they can't tell him what he's being investigated for, except that he has associated with persons in circumstances that are considered undesirable. John Murphy, one of the police officers he himself picked to help him in the Ripper inquiry, takes over his duties, and guess who's there while he's being investigated? Detective Chief Superintendent Maurice Jobson. It slowly starts to become obvious that the corruption within the police force goes all the way to the top. Richard Dawson, the businessman who's obviously dirty, is discovered dead, killed in the explosion at the flat above the newsagents, with his hands chopped off and his teeth smashed out, so the police can't find out his identity. They still do eventually. And now, towards the end, while Hunter's growing ever madder and the plot begins to lose steam, it suddenly happens, the moment we, or at least I, had been waiting for 3 novels now. They catch the Ripper. In the novel, he's called Peter Williams, a lorry driver. In real life, he was called Peter Sutcliffe, also a lorry driver. And, like in the novel, they had him in many, many times before, and they mention it in the book as well. The interviews they conduct with Peter Williams are pretty spot on to how the interviews were conducted in real life. Most of how Sutcliffe confessed to his crimes is accurate to how Williams does it. Moreover, Sutcliffe was apprehended while he was with a prostitute in his car, and the police interviewed the woman and told her she was the luckiest woman in the country, and supposedly she then vomited on the floor of the interview room, and Peace has that in this novel too. But my absolute favourite part about how Peace writes this part of the novel is how mundane Williams's arrest is, and yet it's totally accurate. Hunter goes for a check-in with the chief constable and is told, "They've caught the fucking Ripper, haven't they?" Hunter goes into the police station to find Williams being questioned, who initially denies it but then confesses to being the Yorkshire Ripper. And the police officers who caught him describe the scene. So one of the police constables who finds him is on probation, 2 weeks on the job. He checks Williams's plates and finds them to be false. So when the police officer looks at the plates, he sees that they've been stuck on with tape. So he and his partner take Williams in. Williams goes for a piss next to where they picked him up, but instead of slipping away, he just hides his weapons. A screwdriver, a knife, a hammer, and some rope hidden behind a water tank. And in real life, Sutcliffe also hid a second knife in the police station he was questioned in. While he's being held, the Ripper inquiry team say they don't like the look of him, And one of the officers goes back to the location where he originally picked him up and finds the hidden weapons. And that's it. That's how he gets caught. There are celebrations at the police station, but Hunter has next to no involvement in actually finding the Ripper. It was sheer luck, a chance seeing of fake plates, which led them to this killer who had murdered at least 13 women, attempted to kill at least 7 more, and there are possibly others as well. And what I loved about this ending was that for the whole of 1980, you're following the top brass. In 74 and 77, you follow journalists and smaller coppers, but in 1980, it's all the top dogs. Assistant chief constables, chief superintendents, blah, blah, blah. And you think, especially if you don't know the details of the Ripper case before reading them, that it'll be one of them that finally manages to figure out how to bring the Ripper in, and it's the complete opposite. A police constable who's been on the job not 2 weeks stumbles across Williams by complete chance, and while his being caught is the climax of the story, or very nearly, it's also incredibly anticlimactic, which is just fantastic and so true to the reality and possibly the mundanity of what it's like actually catching these horrible people. It's so rare that they're caught red-handed or that there's a big chase through the streets. The reality is often much more mundane than that, and 1980 just captures that so well. So while Williams is being questioned, he denies being involved specifically in the Claire Strachan and Janice Ryan murders. And we know by now, or at least assume, that these were carried out by police officers, possibly Robert Craven, maybe Douglas, maybe someone else entirely. Hunter heads back to his hotel room after the 16-hour questioning of Williams, and Helen Marshall visits him. She shows him photographs from an issue of Spunk that Hunter hasn't been able to get his hands on up until now. There's been this one issue missing, and the revelation is that she is also in the issue, the implication being that powerful male police officers have forced or otherwise coerced even female police officers to be involved in their pornographic ring. And she tells Hunter that it was indeed Craven. He races to the Stratford Arms, the original pub which Eddie Dunford shot up in 1974, to find Craven already dead from a shotgun blast to the face, either by his own hand, possibly by someone else, and who chases him there, none other than John Murphy, the man he thought was his friend, but who we now know is as dirty as all of the rest of them. The last line of 1980 ends with just the 2 words, a shot. You don't know at the end of this novel, but Hunter was indeed shot by John Murphy and another dirty copper called Alderman in the Stratford pub, something you find out for certain in 1983, but you can assume from the ending of 1980. And that's it. I'm really excited to bring this series to a close. I've been rereading and analysing these books for so long now. I feel so lost in this disgusting, unsettling world which Peace has created. And I'm looking forward to getting out and analysing something else as much as I've enjoyed them. When I first read 1980, it felt like it was the least important of the 4. Now, though, I think 1977 is probably the least important. There's a lot of 77 explained in 1980, and at some bits, it feels like Hunter is just re-finding out things which have already been made clear by Whitehead in 77. All that being said, Hunter's a really interesting character, more interesting than the perpetually drunk, sleep-deprived and tormented characters of Eddie Dunford, Bob Fraser or Jack Whitehead, the protagonists of the last 2. He's this well-to-do cop, hated by his peers for his job, who's broken down by Yorkshire, who hates Yorkshire, who wants nothing less than to leave and go back to Manchester, where he's originally from, but who gets sucked into the lies, deceit, corruption, and depravity of Leeds, where most of this action takes place. It's more intense following this well-put-together bloke fall apart under the stresses of the Ripper hunt and the deeper conspiracy which is going on in the Red Riding novels than it is watching drunkards and drug addicts fall apart. If somebody's really, really drunk all the time and barely sleeping, and then under the intense pressure of such a heavy job, of course you're going to go a bit mad, but Hunter initially seems like he's got it all together. 1980 also in particular shows how good Peace can be at setting scenes, making you feel like you were there. There are tons of offhand references to Thatcher, the Maze prison hunger strikes of the IRA, Lennon's death, Operation Countryman, which was the investigation into police corruption in the Metropolitan Police, in which, by the way, not a single copper was prosecuted. Nice one, Met. And other events which were current in 1980. Near the beginning, Hunter isn't eating his food, for example, when he's at a pub with another police officer, and this police officer asks if he's not eating out of solidarity with the hunger strikers. That isn't why Hunter isn't eating, but there's no unnecessary exposition given to this. It's just a comment, which helps to make Peace's dialogue some of the best in the business, because the hunger strikes which were going on don't need to be explained so directly towards you. If you know the background, you understand the reference. If you don't, you go and look it up. His dialogue is quickfire, his accents and dialects are spot on, which makes sense because he's from there, and the stream of consciousness style of a lot of his work helps to make you feel really in the mind of the character. Stream of consciousness can sometimes be really difficult to read and unpalatable and sometimes just not done very well. In this case, for the most part, it's really brilliant. And 1983, the next novel, continues with most of these positives and also rounds off the story, bringing us full circle back to 1974, concluding where we began. And it's every bit as dark, disturbing, unsettling, and downright fucked up as the other 3 novels in the series. Thanks for listening to this podcast episode on David Peace's 1980. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, maybe consider supporting me on Patreon. It's patreon.com/JM Alston. That's ALSTON. If you'd like to, it's only £2 a month. You get some sneak peeks into things I'm working on at the moment, some unreleased stuff, specifically music, which nobody else will hear, probably for the best. And yeah, first look at some of the new stuff I'm working on, including my Scrubs essay, my Pigeon essay when I get around to finishing the script, and some other bits and pieces. And of course, a big thanks to everyone who's already subscribed. Apart from that, I'm hoping to get 1983, the last one, out also this month, which would be crazy for me, putting out 2 episodes in 1 month. Then I've got an episode on a video game coming up, and because I'm insane, over the last 4 months, the first 4 months of 2023, I've read 6 different hard-boiled novels, 5 of which have been from Ross MacDonald. Of Ross MacDonald's 18 Lou Archer detective stories, I've already read 5 of them, and I've also read The Big Sleep, and I'm planning on talking about them. I'm not sure if I'll combine the episode or not, or whether I'll talk about each book separately. I don't know if there's enough to say about each one separately, but I really, really love them, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't have read so many. And I'm looking forward to seeing if I have anything interesting to say about them. And that's it. Love you lots. Bye for now.